So it's my absolute pleasure and delight to welcome Dr. David Agassiz to today's entoLIVE webinar. David's going to talk to us about his work on the checklist of the Lepidoptera of the British Isles, the second edition, which he's put together along with a number of other authors. And David's going to tell us some of the stories that have come out of this checklist. And as mentioned, if you'd like to get your hands on a copy of this checklist, you can do so via the British Entomological and Natural History Society website. I'll drop a link in the chat for that. But David, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Kieran. And firstly, the checklist, did you say it is the second edition? The first edition was published at the end of 2013 by the Royal Entomological Society. And there isn't very much difference between them. We've added in the species which have been found or added during the last 10 years. And the publication, I hope, is more manageable now. The British EntSoc's publication is in line with their others and more like a book that you can handle more easily than a big A4 document. So a checklist is a pretty boring subject, really. It's a list of thousands of names. And despite that, it's the kind of thing that a lepidopterist will refer to pretty regularly, especially recorders like county recorders who are always needing to check on things. And I find myself now that I need one as a reminder for names. If I can't remember the name, I know where to look in the checklist, and there it is. And I remember as a youngster starting off, and then, oh goodness, sorry, I'm having difficulty changing screens, and when I was a youngster, this checklist was the only one available covering all of the Lepidoptera. The books like South had the macros, but there was no other convenient list of the micros. As you can see there, that cost 4 shillings or 20 pence in current value. And so it wasn't such an outlay as the £25 requested today, or so it would seem. Now, I found that that was useful not only to remember names, but because it wasn't any other list. It gave you a list when you're looking for things from the start to know which other species to look for. And that's still the case with a list today. And as climate changes, one of the biggest threats to life on Earth is the loss of biodiversity. In order to measure this, we need accurate lists, and so that the changes can be monitored. And in order to have an accurate list, we have to have accurate names, which brings in the need for taxonomy. Taxonomy is the science of naming and cataloging species. The Convention on Biodiversity, an international agreement to conserve biodiversity, runs into problems with what's become known as the taxonomic impediment, because in many parts of the world, names are not sufficiently known. And therefore, you can't say how many species there are and how many are lost and so on. But each of us likes to keep a list of the species we see in the garden, maybe the species we find or have been found in our own particular county. And these all contribute to make an overall list. Now, how many species are there? Oh my goodness. I've got to find that things are changing very rapidly. And this last year, which was a pretty terrible year for moth recording, and then in October, in the autumn, the species in my garden, which I normally think of as migrants, hardly ever seen, this one, Radford's flame shoulder, Leucogaster, the scientific name, as a migrant which occurred here where I live the first time last year. But by this autumn, it was in numbers. There they are, lots of the things. And that was really a very significant change. And at the same time, there were other species, a new invader, the oak rustic, Lebecula is the species name, that was coming in only the second or third year it had been here. And the little, I forget its English name, but I'm forgetting the English. Of course, this is one again, whose name has changed. It used to be called Unionalis, and now it's called Vitrialis. That, which again is normally thought of as a migrant, you might see 2 or 3 a year. I was getting 6 in a night, and on the south coast, they were getting hundreds. And so we see that these little creatures are a very sensitive indicator of the changes that are happening around us. There were other species at the time. This one had a lot of local interest. It was only added to the British list last year. Not only is it a new colonist, but it's also very close to another. This is the spiny hooktip, uncinnular. It's close to the oak hooktip called Binaria. And the differences are very subtle. But with careful recording, we find that we can get the right species and see which one. This one's only been here for 2 or 3 years, and it was overlooked until a year ago. And there were other species at the same time. The scarce, I know as Armigera, the scarce names, again, I need the checklist to remind me, but was normally a very scarce migrant, and now it's become quite common. The delicate, the migrant Vitellina is normally quite scarce, and that became quite common. And so we see just in one's own garden, sudden remarkable changes, which are an indicative of what's happening all over. Now, a list of insects, of course, doesn't come out of the air. There's a whole succession of them, and these have occurred, oh goodness me. After that was Cloyden-Hinks, which was 1979, it was actually prepared by Bradley and his colleagues, and then it was placed by this list by Bradley and Fletcher, which had items so that you could mark your own records in it on each page. And then John Bradley, in his retirement, produced this list, which was the last one before we produced the edition which we're currently talking about. And so how many species are there? Well, the first list by Cloyden-Hinks in 1945 didn't number them, and so it would be a laborious business to go through and work out how many there are. Heslop, as the title suggested, in 1947, were 2,313, and he did a second edition with 2,404, and a third edition showing yet more. And then the main list, which has been with us for a long time, the Cloyden-Hinks from 1972, again, didn't number them, and so there wasn't an accurate measure. But Bradley and Fletcher changed that when they brought out their list, and they numbered them from 1 to 2,495. But then, of course, there were some late additions, and they had to have an A and a B and so on. And then by the time John Bradley produced his list in 2000, there were lots of additional species because other species had been discovered and were added into the list. Some of these were resident, some of them were adventives. And so when we've got a number of species in the list, it's difficult to be sure exactly what number we're talking about. Now, one of the things we wanted to do in this list, that's Bob Hegford and Stella and myself, was to put the adventives, the species which have been brought here by human trade and activity and are not really genuine British species, we put them into a separate appendix, which we have done. And we've also identified, as far as possible, those that are extinct. But of course, extinction is a problem. How long before you can call something extinct? Is it 50 years? But then somebody might discover a new one. Has it been absent all that time, or has it reappeared? And so these categories are quite difficult. And so we've just got a main list, species which have been recorded. It doesn't say that they are resident. They can be migrants. They could have been just discovered once, but either because they're very rare or because nobody's managed to continue finding them. And so the numbers, it's not an easy one. But we, again, it happened by accident, have introduced a new system of numbering. And so like down the bottom here, where you see you've got 73.342. Now, we didn't do all this ourselves. We farmed out the families to specialists around the country. And we gave the families names, numbers rather. And within each family, there were numbers chosen by the person compiling it. And so something like the large yellow underwing, Pronuba, is 73.342. And although this happened by accident because we shared out the families, it seemed worth keeping those numbers, because if it keep like that, when we get a new one, instead of adding an A or a B, we can add an extra decimal. And then in people's computerized list, they remain in a consistent order. And you can see also that the numbers are increasing at an alarming rate. In the roughly 10 years, we've added to the main list over 50 species. It's rather surprising to find that the number of extinctions has reduced. You might think it would have got more. And that is, of course, because some things reckoned to be extinct have been rediscovered. But the adventives keep on increasing and increasing. More and more species brought here by trade through the garden center trade, as well as fruits and vegetables being imported. Sometimes, of course, they become established and get a foothold here, in which case they are moved into the main list. A baseline is important when you're getting numbers, and so hopefully our numbers can be some kind of baseline. But I would like to commend British Butterfly Wildlife publication on the Atlas of the Larger Moths, published in 2019. And that's got you probably, mainly if you know it, a map showing the distribution of each species at that date. And so at a glance, one will be able to see in a few years' time how the distribution has changed, whether populations have declined, whether they've increased, whether they've moved northwards, and so on. And this is all going to be quite important for keeping an eye on what is happening to our fauna. Now, we are always having to add new species, new ones which have been newly discovered or have newly arrived by migration or population spread. And then sometimes one species which is thought to be one species is found to be two. And so we've got a second species because of newly recognized differences. deletions happen when a species is properly known to be extinct, and that's not very often that that's clear. And then sometimes species which had thought to be separate are lumped together. And so how are these sorted out? Now here is an example. This is a species of Batrachodra. Now in a publication on the European species, there appeared two illustrations of the male genitalia. The one on the left is a more artistic picture, and the one on the right is more as it would appear on the slide. But despite that, you can see there are differences. There's a bit of a difference in the shape of the vulva. The sacculus here is longer and narrower and rather thicker here, and these and other lobes are a different shape. And in fact, the author unwittingly illustrated two different species in the same book under the same name. Now, it was later found, or it had been found at a similar time, that DNA was showing two different species here. And then the morphological differences were spotted. But again, here is another problem. When that happens, and this species was known as Batrachodra piniculella, and there are two species. And we found that one of them feeds on pine and one on spruce. So you would think it would be the one on pine that was called piniculella. But you can't jump to conclusions like that. By looking at, it has to be done by looking at the original material or descriptions. And that often requires quite a bit of careful research. And of course, there's people all over Europe doing this, and we can, in many ways, follow what's done in other countries. But that shows the kind of problem that occurs. And you need to look into the original descriptions or illustrations, or if possible, the original type specimens. And then these ones which are put together. Now, I've only got some rather miserable photographs of dead specimens. The deep brown dart and the northern deep brown dart you'll find in the latest checklist have been combined into one species. Lüneburgensis is the species all over Europe. And the fact that we've got two different forms in this country means that they have to be regarded as one species. But some of the pugs, it lies rather more difficult. Here, for example, you've got the wormwood pug and the ling pug, absinthiator and goosensiator, which they are now determined to be different species, even though you can see from these rather grotty specimens, they look rather similar. Those are now two separate species, whereas Jasioniator, the Jasione pug, and the Campanula pug, which look different, they have different food plants, they are now reckoned to be the same species. And so you can never be sure quite what's going to happen. So we have to make sure we've got the right name for a species. Now, the principle of priority is one of the main ones that the International Commission on Zoological Nomenclature depends on. This means the oldest name is the one that counts. And if we go back and back until we've got the oldest name, happily, there should then be real stability without more changes. Occasionally, some will go on searching, will find an older name, and that upsets things. It's only scientific names that this have kind of validity. And of course, when we're looking for the oldest, that's why we need the dates attached to the author when we've got the name of a species. And very occasionally, you got two species given a different name at about the same time. And then it's important to know exactly not just the year, but even when in the year that publication appeared in order for the oldest name to be the one that's chosen. There's been a lot of debate about English names. A lot of it's been aired in the latest edition of Atropos. Of course, English names, especially for people who haven't learnt the classics, are much easier, and they are good for making things popular. But they don't have any scientific validity, and there is no way of choosing one name over another other than popular usage. Now, we have, as you know, a scientific name is a genus and a species. And with the Lepidoptera, if you have a lot of species that look much the same, like perhaps the wainscots, then you would expect them to be in the same genus. Here, lepidopterists take issue with other biologists. If you're a botanist, then the first thing you notice about an oak tree is that it's an oak, and so it's a quercus species. It's first of all in the genus, and then you decide whether it's an English oak, a pedunculate oak, or a sessile oak, or an evergreen oak, or a turkey oak, and so on. But with Lepidoptera, the genus is much more of a human invention. We decide which ones are put together in a genus, and then somebody goes and looks carefully at that genus and finds all sorts of differences between it, and they sometimes split them up into a new genus. And so the genus names are much more changeable than the species names. And for lepidopterists, the species names are the more important, because that is the natural animal that occurs. Now, the rules of the ICZN code are that the species name, they sometimes call it the specific epithet, should agree in gender with the genus. But if the genus keeps changing, then the ending of the English name might have to change as well, from "our" to "us" and back again, and so on. And so lepidopterists have insisted that the original spelling of the scientific name is the one that should count. And sometimes they are at odds with the rest of the scientific community for that reason. But it's the only way in Lepidoptera that we can get some stability. And so that's one of the things that we've had to look into in many cases, was the original spelling of the name. Now, sometimes, this is part of the introduction to the code, and I'll give you a chance to read that. And of course, it hints with the ignorance, vanity, and obstinacy of individual predilections that names are not always what you would want them to be. But they do need to be precise and exact. And it's not always easy to know what it is. Now, with modern naming of species, it's a requirement that the holotype, the main type that defines a species, is so labeled and then put in an appropriate museum. And so here is an example of a species I named not very long ago, and the holotype, that species, determines what the others of the species can be. So anything else given that name has got to agree in its morphology and its DNA with that specimen. But of course, with older species, which were named 100 or more years ago, you don't always have the type specimen. You might have just a description. You might have a collection with a series of them, and then someone has to choose a lectotype and so on and so forth. And so going back in older collections, older namings, to the original source is quite important. Well, I think probably that is enough without going any further. But I would like to thank my colleagues, Bob and Stella, who did a lot of work on the details, particularly on the publications and the dates of names, which we have included in the checklist, and also to Paul Chapman for helping me with some pictures of recent species. Okay, thank you.